and welcome to the very first episode of The Security Affair, the flagship podcast of the Centre for International Security and Economic Strategy, or CISES, where we explore strategy, defence, economics and international security. I'm Alexander Anderson, Director of Policy at CISES. Today we're diving into one of the most misunderstood actors on the global stage, North Korea. Today I'm joined by our Centre's very own Fleur Boehm to discuss how North Korea interacts with the outside world, but not in a way that has so often permeated both academic and public discourse. Fleur argues that North Korea is not a rogue state, but a nation that is, despite appearances, well integrated within the international community. Fleur has just finished an MA in International Studies and Diplomacy at SOAS, with her thesis focusing on North Korea's partnerships with South and Southeast Asian nations. She holds a BA in Japanese Studies from the University of Cambridge. One of the most common misconceptions about North Korea is that it's an unpredictable pariah of the international community, threatening to unleash its nuclear weapons upon its neighbours. Could you explain why this isn't the case?
So, there are several reasons as to why this is only a partial truth. First of all, describing North Korea as a pariah state, meaning a state that is broadly rejected by the international community, is factually inaccurate. As of 2019, North Korea had established diplomatic ties, I believe, with around 164 countries, which means that it is somewhat integrated within the world community. Second of all, I think another reason that is important to keep in mind regarding North Korea is the fact that it is not merely threatening to use nuclear weapons at its own whim, so to say. It is a state that still faces the realities of the Cold War on a daily basis, and that has a genuine fear or security concern regarding the United States and its southern neighbor. So this stems from a genuine security concern.
Yeah, thank you. What first drew you to study North Korea? I think it's a pretty overlooked area.
Yeah, so there are several reasons. I was first drawn to the humanitarian aspect of the regime. I remember being maybe 12, 13 and seeing this sort of speech by a defector. I believe at the UNICEF, if I'm not incorrect, about her experience as a minor defecting from North Korea. And I remember feeling very touched by that testimony and thinking, how can these things still be happening? And so that's what first drew me to this question of the hermit kingdom, this country that we know little about, with its people being kind of living in complete isolation, apparently, from the rest of the world. Which then drew me to really question, well, if it's such a hermit kingdom, how can this country sustain itself? And that grew from my broader interest into East Asian history. But so I was kind of questioning that notion from the beginning, and that's what kind of led me into that rabbit hole, so to say.
Okay, great. So tying into what you said, how it can sustain itself, a lot of the information we have publicly disseminated is focused on how China plays a key role in that. However, your work has focused on North Korea's ties outside of its immediate region in East Asia. So would you say this goes against the common sentiment that China is the DPRK's most important and influential partner?
So this is an interesting question because I think my work, in fact, complements this vision. I think it is factually accurate to state that China is North Korea's main trading partner, main economic sponsor, that is the reality. However, I think it's important to bear in mind that North Korea is not a state that is being kind of single-handedly sponsored by another state. There are several countries that are contributing to the North Korean economy, albeit to varying degrees. So I think my work, if anything, is I've specifically focused on the perception of North Korea and its status. I think looking at other countries in Southeast Asia, we clearly see that these countries have cultural ties, political ties, and sometimes economic ties with North Korea, and I think that is a very important nuance, really, to studying North Korean politics and foreign policy in general.
Could you perhaps share an example of one of these partnerships, perhaps in Southeast Asia, which has been your regional focus, that you found particularly surprising or revealing?
So I think, for instance, with the case of Indonesia, because in terms of Southeast Asia, I've mostly focused on Indonesia and Vietnam. I think the case of Indonesia is particularly interesting because we see, well, Indonesia is well known for its politics of non-alignment, right? It is sort of the founding member of the non-aligned movement in 1975. So this is deeply ingrained in Indonesian politics. And this is interesting to see that actually there is a convergence almost of ideologies between Indonesia and North Korea, which North Korea has sort of sustained. For instance, between Indonesia and North Korea, there are yearly Kim Il Sung flower festivals. So, for instance, this flower was named after Kim Il Sung when he visited the Bogor Gardens in Indonesia with President Sukarno at the time. And so it was named after him, and the flower really became a sort of symbol of that friendship. One might think that these festivals are not so important, but they serve an important role in soft power. They happen yearly. Ministers meet there. They're kind of like track 1.5 events, so to say. So, for instance, this is a big one. Indonesia has also conferred North Korea with a lot of kind of acknowledgement, political acknowledgement. For instance, in 2015, Kim Jong-un received the Sukarno Star Award from, I believe, one of Sukarno's daughters, for his great statesmanship and his contribution to peace to the Korean Peninsula. So there is really kind of this bilateral relationship happening on the side of what the Western world might perceive. I guess the boundaries are sort of more blurred. It's not all black and white. So I think that sort of political recognition, so North Korea as a respectable interlocutor, and the soft power ties were sort of surprising to me because I had never heard about them.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. Maybe looking at a bit different angle, do you believe academia is as much at fault as the general public in failing to understand the so-called hermit kingdom?
I think academia has both, well, in the early stages of the study of North Korea, I believe academia has perpetuated that vision. Definitely, I think. But I think in more recent years, scholars have increasingly tried to present a more nuanced image or picture of the country. However, I believe a lot of academics are probably not looking deep enough when it comes to North Korea. For instance, even in my work, a lot of the books I consulted that cover North Korean foreign policy always cover the same examples. For instance, it'll be often bilateral ties between the DPRK and Russia, the DPRK in China, Japan, the United States. These are always the examples that come up. It's only actually this year that a very interesting book came out looking deeply into the ties between North Korea and Southeast Asia. That's 2025. And I think this is, throughout my entire thesis, this is the only book that I found that was actually covering this in depth. So I think there is a lack of, I don't know if it's interest, but yeah, I think academics always using the same examples really perpetuates an image of a country with very restricted diplomatic engagement, which I think is not a true representation of the reality.
So, looking at a different, I think a much stronger perception of North Korea, the media. So, why do you think the media continues to rely on this hermit kingdom image, even when research suggests that its reality, as always, is much more complicated?
I think there are two main factors. The first one is probably the humanitarian situation in North Korea. It is true to say that the people of North Korea live in nearly complete isolation. So, but I think what maybe the general media is not able to grasp is that there is a difference in how the population is living and the state itself. So I think there is a sort of conflation between how, yeah, the general public is living and how, yeah, the the government sort of, or the regime really diplomatically engage the rest of the international community. And I think, yeah, there's really a lack of understanding there. Um, the second element is, I believe that maybe the media has focused on bilateral ties of notable importance. For instance, China and North Korea with sort of important trade data or trade numbers. With Russia, for example, North Korea's involvement in the war with Ukraine, I think there maybe is a lack of interest in covering ties that may be seen as more negligible or minor, and just dismissing them as not existing. And I think that's also a big mistake, because there are economic ties happening. There are military ties with some of these countries. For example, I studied Pakistan at length, Pakistan and North Korea's relations, and there is nuclear proliferation there, allegations thereof that have been proven. But I think there's just, yeah, a lack of interest in covering that, because it might not be as big, maybe in terms of headlines, as those other topics might get. Yeah.
Okay, so tying on from what you just said, you mentioned Pakistan as an example. You mentioned, of course, Indonesia in depth. What are North Korea's partnerships in South and Southeast Asian regions? Are there other significant partnerships?
So starting with South Asia, it's important, for example, for instance, to say that North Korea has ties with numerous countries in South Asia alone. India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, the Maldives. I won't list all of them. But the more significant ones are with Pakistan and India there, simply because there are allegations of nuclear proliferation between Pakistan and North Korea, where it is alleged that Pakistan has supplied North Korea with centrifuges and helped them develop nuclear technology. That has since been mostly proven. I would say that since the early 2000s, there hasn't been much progress on this. It has been alleged by the United States, the government of the former Prime Minister, but it has since stopped this debate. But there's relevant evidence. In terms of India, well, the bilateral relations were established in 1962. So that's a while ago. And the bilateral relations have been important in the cultural arena, in the political arena. For example, India played a very important role already in terms of the repatriation of refugees after the Korean War. So it's been on the long term. India is also a very important member of the non-aligned movement. So that's also very important. Yeah, I think India has also done some trade with North Korea. For example, as of 2017, 2016, 2017, it was often said that India was the third largest trading partner for North Korea. So that's pretty relevant. Southeast Asia, as I've touched on before, with Indonesia, we have mostly soft power cultural ties that are quite important. With Vietnam, it is somewhat similar, except I would say the two states are not as shy, so to say, to engage in more public displays of affinity. I think it's also relevant that Vietnam hosted the bilateral summit with the United States. With Vietnam, there have been a lot of sort of track one events, public praises, etc. So North Korea has really sort of used that praise received from Vietnam to gain legitimacy in its own right. So yeah, that's played an important role.
Okay, great. So you mentioned India and Indonesia as part of the non-aligned movement, and how that has sort of, to some extent, influenced the relationships with North Korea. So, would you say is there a Western bias in relationships with North Korea, or in its perception in academia and media, or is North Korea universally misrepresented?
I would definitely say that there is a Western bias. I believe that, for example, this notion of North Korea as a irrational, evil state, it can be traced back to 2002 with then President Bush um, describing North Korea as part of this axis of evil, engaging in international terrorism. So I believe that it has since tainted both media and academia, and it has created this binary of friendly or foe, so to say. So I believe that in the Western world, there is maybe a lack of understanding in terms of a country engaging with North Korea, but not necessarily siding with North Korea. For instance, Indonesia, while it has close rapport with North Korea, so to say, it has repeatedly and consistently condemned nuclear tests and ballistic missile tests. Um, so I think looking at South and Southeast Asia reveals that the way we understand international relations and diplomacy in general is probably more nuanced than what we think. It's not just about, so to say, siding with a country. There are no sides. It's about meaningful engagement. And I believe that countries, for example, like Indonesia and India, have truly placed engagement within a strategy of denuclearization, or at least enticing North Korea to denuclearize. So I do believe that I think with this Western bias, um, these issues, these countries are sort of outside of that scope. I think, unfortunately, I think there's a lack of understanding of meaningful and gradual engagement in the Western world, at least with regards to North Korea.
Okay. We'll get back to Western engagement with North Korea a bit later, but would you say these partnerships in South and Southeast Asia, are they significant enough to change North Korea's status on the international stage, even if it not its perception?
I believe that they are, because I believe that North Korea has used these partnerships to make claims, and it has almost given North Korea's claims some foundation. For instance, North Korea is trying to. It's one of its main objectives is to gain nuclear status. That's a huge source of prestige, and it believes that it has the right to do so because Pakistan and India both have acquired nuclear power outside of the ramifications of the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. So the criticism of North Korea is often that it has developed its nuclear weapons program in kind of despite that treaty, in spite of that treaty. But the reality is that it is not the only country in the world to have done so. And both Pakistan and India, and even more so India, have received tacit recognition of their power status, de facto recognition, really. So North Korea is really is portraying in its state media India and Pakistan as responsible nuclear states. And by contrast, North Korea often mentions the spirit of the NPT. For instance, in its state media, it often depicts the United States as the only country to have actually used atomic weapons and to often threaten other countries to use them. By contrast, it says that India and Pakistan may have acquired these weapons outside of the treaty, but they have abided by the spirit. And so I believe that North Korea is trying, whether that is successful or not, to gain this legitimacy. And there's some truth to that, is the fact that, well, North Korea exited the NPT in 2003, so it's not tied by it. Looking more at Southeast Asia, well, North Korea has really attempted to almost normalize itself, sort of, because North Korea has established diplomatic ties with all 10 ASEAN states. And as part of the non-aligned movement and the ASEAN Regional Forum, for instance, is a multilateral forum that North Korea often participates in. It has gained some sort of, well, it is a diplomatic actor that is engaging with foreign powers on a regular basis. So it has definitely kind of attempted to break free from that perception of a completely isolated state. And I believe that, for example, Vietnam, that is very vocal in recognizing North Korea and meeting, and this, for example, the latest meeting between the heads of state of Vietnam and North Korea was there was a long handshake and last month, and I think these symbolic acts do a lot in terms of changing the perception of North Korea. Maybe not legitimizing its nuclear development. That's completely outside of what is happening right now. But North Korea is definitely becoming sort of a normal diplomatic actor, a normal state, and I think that is definitely shifting from the narrative we've seen so far. And I think these countries are definitely helping North Korea's bid for status.
Okay. So talking about multilateral forums, you mentioned the Asian Forum, Regional Forum. Has North Korea been an active participant in these multilateral and maybe more broadly global frameworks?
Mm-hmm. I think, well, it depends how we understand active. In terms of North Korea actively engaging in dialogue and resolving issues maybe the same way Indonesia has, definitely not. That's an easy answer to give. However, North Korea has been consistent. It has sent its delegates consistently over the years to both the non-aligned movement meeting and the ASEAN Regional Forum. So it may not be the most active state in formulating policy or agreements, but it is definitely always in attendance. And these meetings have seen kind of other meetings on the sidelines as well. So I do believe that North Korea is not even a matter of crediting North Korea with anything. It's just recognizing the fact that North Korea is sitting at the table, and that's just a fact. So I think, yeah, it's important to say that. However, discussing more maybe the United Nations, etc., that is a different story. It's important to say that North Korea is still left out of major multilateral sort of institutions like the IMF, etc. North Korea is not part of these. So here, it's important to say that North Korea is not a member of the international community like maybe in the Western world, completely integrated, but it is somewhat integrated. So I think that's important.
Okay. Talking maybe about more cynically about the failures of its integration in multilateral frameworks, an example that comes to mind is the failure of the six-party talks under successive US administrations, which attempted to lead to denuclearization of North Korea. While that failure is obviously due to a range of various reasons on all sides of those talks, could we say that North Korea is generally attempting to integrate itself, or as you suggest, it is already integrated, so maybe integrating itself further into the international community?
I think the six-party talks is an interesting example because these are mostly countries that North Korea has not normalized relations with, maybe apart from China. So I think this is very interesting. In that case, I think whether North Korea is seeking integration or recognition is, I think, the relevant question here. I think the six-party talks definitely gave the North Korean regime the legitimacy it was seeking. I think having a state like North Korea sat at the same table as the United States, China, it really kind of elevates the regime in a way. Whether it was an earnest attempt or not, this is still subject to speculation. In general, academics recognize that North Korea was not sort of going to budge on its list of requests, so it was unlikely to really make any progress. However, a lot of these talks, the six-part talks being one example, have failed because of as you mentioned, a range of reasons, both on the side of the United States and on the North Korean side. So I believe that's important to say. But I believe that, yes, definitely these sort of multilateral forums are sort of a platform for North Korea to seek legitimacy, if not integration. I think legitimacy is at the center. If it does not gain integration, it will use it in its bid for legitimacy.
Okay. Maybe moving more into speculation here, but can North Korea gain legitimacy given that it is in what some might call a rogue nuclear state, and considering its volatile relationship with the United States, which is definitely a major player in the international system, as well as South Korea. It's an unresolved situation with South Korea, rather.
The question of legitimacy is hard to answer because it depends what sort of legitimacy we are talking about. First of all, I want to re-emphasize that maybe outside of the West, for example, in Southeast Asia, North Korea is already legitimized as a state, as a diplomatic, not partner, but like I said, interlocutor. It's a respectable state. Nuclear legitimacy, on the other hand, is a completely different issue, which North Korea is unlikely to ever get. I believe there are concerns as to the safety, of course, because North Korea has amended its constitution numerous times, and whether North Korea would be using it for defensive or offensive purposes is unclear. So the issue of nuclear legitimacy, I think I can confidently say that North Korea will never get sort of an identity of a recognized nuclear power, because obviously there are so many concerns, and it would kind of put into question the entire nuclear world order, so to say. However, in terms of the bare minimum, the diplomatic aspect, it has gained some sort of legitimacy. And I think particularly if we look at Kim Jong-un currently, maybe 2018, 2017, so to say, Kim Jong-un is, I mean, the only North Korean leader, so to say, to have a direct bilateral meeting with American head of state. So I think there was definitely some legitimacy gained from that, at least domestically, but also projecting internationally. North Korea is a state that is relevant enough to warrant the head of the Western world, so to say, meeting with them. So I think there is definitely a legitimacy boost. Whether North Korea will get more and more legitimacy, I think it's important to look at China and Russia in that case, because I think looking at those relations kind of indicate to us that North Korea is its nuclear identity unchanged.
Speaking, maybe moving into focusing on the East Asian region, how do you believe North Korea's relationships will fare under the Lee administration in South Korea and the more hawkish Sanae Takeichi government in Japan?
So I think with Takaichi in Japan and Lee in South Korea, we see two very different policy directions. I think Takaichi is probably going to follow a more traditional defensive path, reinforcing the alliance with the United States, focusing on deterrence, obviously a complete focus on complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization, which has remained the United States goal. And I think Lee, with the recent announcement of the South Korean government's new end policy that privileges engagement and dialogue, we see a complete different approach, because in that policy, denuclearization would be kept as an end goal, so to say, but the primary goal would be freezing the nuclear program, ensuring immediate security. So I think we see two challenging visions for what the security architecture of Northeast Asia should look like. That does not mean that they cannot cooperate, I believe that the trilateral alliance between the United States, Japan, and South Korea remains the most important tool in managing the nuclear risk that poses North Korea. Whether these two countries can come to an agreement and what sort of policy will come out of this trilateral cooperation will massively depend on the Trump administration, what direction they will choose to take. Simply because Japan, because of its constitution, has merely a defensive military, so it cannot really engage abroad, and the United States act as sort of a bridge between those two nations. So how the relations will develop, I believe Kim Jong-un has already made that very clear by demanding direct access to Donald Trump and wanting to bypass South Korea entirely. I believe once Kim Jong-un has acquired that opportunity a few years ago, there is no complete dismissal of South Korea and Japan. There's no interest. So how will that fare? It will really depend on what the United States will choose to do in the future with those two regional partners.
So, in a perfect link to the next question, in one of your recent pieces for CISES, you analysed Prime Minister Sanae Takeichi's first summit with President Trump in Tokyo. You noted that while the meeting reaffirmed the alliance, it produced few concrete defence initiatives, which is especially relevant in your comments about Japan's military. Given that, how do you think Japan's renewed alignment or stronger alignment with Washington might affect regional stability and North Korea's diplomacy?
I believe that this sort of hyper-focus on the United States will leave Japan in a position where it needs to engage with South Korea directly, simply because so far the Trump administration has displayed a sort of reluctance to get engaged, so to say, in regional affairs in that region particularly, because it has been focused elsewhere. So I do not believe that the North Korean issue is a priority for the Trump administration at the moment. But I do believe that both Japan and South Korea are in a position of growing insecurity. Recently, we've seen North Korea engaging in more public displays of friendliness, so to say, with China and Russia. More recently, in September of this year, the Beijing military parade. And I believe that this shifting dynamic in the region really creates a sense of insecurity for South Korea and Japan. I mean, North Korea has changed its constitution last year and for the first time described South Korea as an enemy state. So we're really seeing a shift in sort of the ontology, political ontology of North Korea. So I believe that Japan will face kind of two main options. Either it will continue to try to get the United States to engage more deeply in the region and commit to increased deterrence, or it will turn to South Korea. And I think it will have to turn to South Korea regardless, because being on the same peninsula and originally being the same nation, South Korea is the only country that's really going to be able to create a policy that is informed about North Korea. So unless Japan can do that, I think unfortunately the sense of insecurity will only grow in the next few years. So yeah, I believe really the regional aspect of it will become more and more important.
So speaking of South Korea, South Korea's President Lee Jae-myung announced a few months ago a policy called END, which you mentioned, or exchange normalization and denuclearization. This echoes previous attempts at normalizations by various South Korean governments. In your opinion, a bit speculative, are we likely to see more or less progress with END? You mentioned denuclearization as a sort of long-term ideal. But what about exchange and normalization? Are those realistic, at least in the medium term?
So this is going to be mainly a personal opinion, informed but personal opinion on the matter. I believe looking at past administrations, maybe under Moon, for example, in the years 2017, 2018, I believe that engagement has not been 100% successful, but it has been more successful than purely punitive measures such as sanctions. Sanctions have been proven ineffective. They do not work for the humanitarian aspect, they do not work for the nuclear aspect. They have failed to address the issues and sort of honestly led to created a situation where the nuclear program has developed tremendously while the population has suffered increasingly. I believe engagement is a chance to halt the program. Whether denuclearization itself is a realistic goal today, I personally don't think it is. I don't think it is attainable at the moment. Looking at the actions of North Korea, it has integrated nuclear development as part of its constitution and the basis of the leader's legitimacy and the entire political system. The Juche ideology, which is the entire political culture for North Korea, places emphasis on the importance of defense against imperialist forces through nuclear means in recent years specifically. So that's against the United States. So whether denuclearization is attainable, I do not believe so. Simply because it is the only guarantee at the moment for the North Korean regime that it will sustain itself. And it is also the only real propaganda factor, really domestically, that allows it to keep control. It is a show of strength to its population, but also internationally. North Korea might be despised, so to say, internationally, but it is feared. And I think fear is definitely a factor there. So I think engagement really creates solutions. There could be agreements, for example, for the lifting of certain economic sanctions. There may be a freeze of certain facilities, but complete denuclearization seems very far-fetched at the moment.
Okay, thank you. To part 1. We'll be back next week with part 2 of our conversation on North Korea's diplomacy. The Security Affair is the Centre for International Security and Economic Strategies podcast, looking at the ideas, events, and decisions shaping strategy, defence, economics, and international security. I'm Alexander Anderson. Our guest today has been Fleur Boehm. See you next time.